Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today and bearing with me as I slowly get back to the swing of creating content more regularly, God willing, let's hope. And of course, rather than tackling my ever-expanding, never-ending backlog, here I am making an entirely new video from scratch, but the occasion is somewhat necessary because this mouthpiece is going to be leaving my collection shortly and heading into the hands of someone who will hopefully use it a little bit more frequently. And it's been a fun mouthpiece to mess around on, and I've learned a decent bit from it. So without further ado, the Denis Wick Heritage 3B. So for some quick context here, I am an avid cornetist and brass bander. I almost feel like the cornet speaks to me more deeply than the trumpet does, and that's kind of an outspoken opinion to have here in the US, but nonetheless that's how I truly feel. Every time I pick up a cornet, it really does speak to my heart, and moreover, there is a very specific sound concept that I hear in my head and want to produce. It's a very traditional brass band sort of sound, and as a result, I end up playing on and favoring equipment like Denis Wick mouthpieces. My usual weapon of choice interfacing between my lips and the horn is a Denis Wick 2B, which is quite similar. You'll find two 2Bs on the rack behind me. If I can point to them, there's one, a standard blank and gold plate, and there's the other one that I acquired later, a heavy top and silver plate that I even like a little bit more than that. The Heritage is the third of the three blanks that Denis Wick offers. Something to bear in mind since I bring up the standard and the heavyweight is that the Heritage is not necessarily any appreciably lighter than the standard weight, even though it may look that way. Rather, it is slimmer up top and a little bit fatter down on the bottom, so less mass at the rim wall and more at the body. Looking here at this mouthpiece, it says Denis Wick London 3B on one side. It's got their little Heritage logo on the other. And you might notice the mixed plating that this mouthpiece comes in. I feel like the most common configuration I see for Heritage mouthpieces is indeed this, the gold rim and cup with a silver body, which I think looks pretty cool. I've seen all gold Heritage mouthpieces. In fact, my bandmate Dave in the Spokane Brass Band, when he's playing B-flat cornet and not soprano, plays on that very setup, an all gold Heritage 3B. They look a little funny to me, to be honest. I really like the mixed plating that this one has. Spec-wise, it's a little bit tough to say conclusively. It's a little bit clearer when you think about the Denis Wick 2. Its inner diameter measures out at squarely 17 millimeters, and it is very much in line with your Yamaha 16s or 16Es, your Bach 1.5s and 1.25s. If you're a Bach 1.5C player and you switch to cornet and you want a Denis Wick mouthpiece, you're likely going to end up on a 2 or a 2B as the best fit for you. A lot of 3C players tend to end up on the Denis Wick 4 or 4B. I don't think that's necessarily the best fit. I honestly do think that the Denis Wick 3 does line up really well with the Bach 3. At the very least, the modern Bach 3, which really is not that much smaller than a 1.5, not nearly as much as you might think. I know the spec book calls it 16.3 millimeters. That's absurd. Maybe back in the New York era where mouthpieces were generally a little bit smaller, then the 3C was about 16.3 millimeters, but these days they clock in at 16.7, 16.8 easily. So I think the Denis Wick 3 lines up nicely with the Bach 3, whereas the Denis Wick 4, sure, you can use it as a 3C player, but it might be more in line with you like 5C and 6C type players, and then the Denis Wick 5 and S kind of tend to line up nicely for 7C, even 10.5C type players. The Denis Wick B Cup is truly one of my absolute favorites for brass band. It is maybe less V and a little bit more U than you might expect, because I feel like when we talk about cornet cups in brass band, we very often hear the term deep V. Trumpet players love that phrase, deep V cup this, deep V cup that. This is a little bit more bowl-shaped than you might expect, and ironically, when you have a bowl cup, it actually has a little bit more volume on the sides of the cup than the V cup that we all rave about. So in my opinion, it actually is very effective in producing sort of a darker and fluffier sound. Keep in mind, it is much shallower than the no-letter cup in Denis Wick's line. I played a Denis Wick 2 with no letter for a while, and that was quite an exhausting and, looking back on it, rather tubby sounding mouthpiece. You can definitely make it work for back row playing, and there have been people who make it work for front row, but in my opinion, it just loses a certain amount of necessary resonance in the higher frequencies. The other noteworthy thing about most Denis Wick cornet mouthpieces is that they let a lot of wind through by way of a very large throat. Whereas as a trumpet player, you might be used to a size 27 throat, which is to say 0.144 of an inch or 3.66 millimeters, the Denis Wicks clock in quite large. The no-letter series, of course, is a little bit larger at 4.6 millimeters, but even the 3B is 4.3, which is 0.1695 of an inch or a size 18 on the drill chart. quite a bit larger. Now, as we launch into a discussion of how this mouthpiece feels to play and how it sounds, I'd like to introduce today's cornets that we're using. We've got your standard medium-large bore Getzen 381, which I think produces a really nice brass band sort of tone. It's a little bit thinner and wispier. Then we've also got this pre-letter Elkhart Conn 38A Constellation model cornet. Also quite a dark sound, but it's just a little bit more expansive. It's got a really just whopping large bore and not quite as huge of a bell flare as you might expect, so the sound is thick but maybe not as spread out. I picked up this Heritage 3B used pretty shortly after I got my first 2B, the gold one there in the standard blank, and I demoed them side by side. This was about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago, my goodness. And the first thing I noticed, and this is something I'm hesitant to believe whenever any manufacturer says it, this blank does make the high notes pop just a little bit more. It's really, I didn't expect it to be as pronounced as it was, but I was comfortably playing quite a bit higher on the Heritage blank than on the standard blank. And of course the inner diameter is smaller on the 3 than the 2, but actually that tends to work against me in most cases. My lips tend to swell a little bit if I do a lot of dexterous high playing, and smaller inner diameters like the 3 actually don't cooperate at all with me as I play, and that's part of the reason I'm selling this mouthpiece, is the 3 did end up being too much of a step down for me. And this mouthpiece, for what it's worth, considering this is a relatively deep cup and a large throat, it doesn't sit flat on the pitch in the upper register. In fact, I was getting screwed with a little bit when I was playing because my Fs and Gs at the top of the staff were slotting a lot sharper than I was used to, so this thing definitely stays right on the money up there. But nonetheless, the thinner wall of that rim really does reduce the inertial effects of the mouthpiece and really does make the high notes respond just that little bit easier. But like I mentioned, to compensate for the thinner walled rim, Denis Wick designed the Heritage blank with a little bit more of a stout body in comparison to the standard blank, and that I think is what affords this mouthpiece to still have the amount of core and richness that I generally like for brass band playing. It definitely doesn't have the same amount of stability as something like a heavy top, which is what I've ended up on and generally prefer now if I'm really looking for the thickest, darkest sound possible. But nonetheless, I think there is a good amount of density to the tone for brass band or solo work because of this slightly more stout body. Now, a full discussion of inertia and stability principles is far too involved for this video. You can check out that video up in the card, which is extremely long and rambly and nerdy and hopefully covers it a little bit better. But in essence, with this thinner walled rim reducing the inertial effects of the player inputting energy into the instrument, we definitely get a little bit more front to the notes on a Heritage blank than on a standard or especially heavy top blank. To some that is desirable. To me, as someone who tends to over-tongue and the sound that I am naturally predisposed to produce is not as fluffy and round as what I like to hear up here, this is not always desirable. Definitely for front row playing, I like to have stronger articulations, but if I'm doing solo playing and I really desire the darkest, thickest, fluffiest sound possible, this is a little bit overkill on the front end for me. I mentioned today's contenders here, and I've recorded a little bit on each to sort of compare how this mouthpiece does on two rather different cornets, and it's tough to say which I like better. I do think this mouthpiece sounds more in keeping with what I like to hear on the Getzen, which is to say, again, that thin and wispy brass band sound that still has sort of a dark core to it or a certain amount of density, but I think it feels a little bit better on the Constellation. I do think the Getzen demands a little bit of a wider inner diameter for the work that I do, whereas the Constellation is already such a big, like, tubby sort of horn that, yeah, a 3 inner diameter does maybe help to actually refocus it a little bit. But in a more general sense, I think it is really impressive what this As I was saying before that rude interruption, I'm really impressed by the amount of sounds that this mouthpiece specifically, yes, but also just Denis Wick B cups in general and Heritage pieces in general can produce. You've got the brass band tone under wraps, like I keep saying, but that's not to say that you can't do jazz ballads or even a little bit of brighter stuff with this. I think first of all, the contrast is really impressive when you play loudly versus when you play softly. But, like I always allude to in my reviews, I like to test jazz ballads out on basically anything I touch nowadays, and this really does work for that purpose. This is a little bit of a bittersweet goodbye. This is a really fun mouthpiece to play on, and I'm kind of sad to have to get rid of it, but to be honest, it's for the better. My friend is going to get a lot more use out of this than I am. I think Denis Wick's B cups are really outstanding for brass band use. Like I said, I've used them in the front row. I think they are plenty good for back row. Some people will consider them too dark or a little bit too hard to play, sure. But in my shoes, I've rarely played on a more fun brass band cup than the Denis Wick B. If anybody has any leads on a Heritage 2B, definitely reach out to me. I might be interested. And in fact, if we can get this video to, let's say, 50 likes, I'll do a comparison between the standard heavy top and Heritage 2Bs. Whether that means I borrow or buy, we'll find out. But I really do want to do a video highlighting all three of those blanks because in my testing, there have been a surprisingly pronounced degree of differences between the three, and I think YouTube deserves to see a little in-depth analysis. And I think that is an appropriate place to halt my yammering for tonight. I'm definitely ready for bed at this point, so we'll round it off there. Once again, that was the Denis Wick Heritage 3B. I hope you enjoyed this video. It definitely has been a while since I've posted a cornet mouthpiece spotlight, and in general, I think I ought to do more mouthpiece spotlights considering my rather extensive collection. That is not all of them, by the way, in case you were wondering. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below. Once again, 50 likes, you know what to do. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, like the vast majority of my viewers, please consider doing so. It's a small gesture with a huge impact on the channel as we move forward and keep making more content like this. And that's where we'll call it a day. Until next time, we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks, y'all.
Ooh, that was mint. That was not mint.
Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.